What if I told you that tonight you're not just watching history, you're living it? Welcome to the Forbidden City. No, not the tourist brochure version. I mean the real one. The one behind the vermilion walls, where your breath belongs to the Bureau of Rights, your bedtime is chosen by an astrologer, and your private life? It's a state-run operation. You're not just anyone. You're the Emperor, the Son of Heaven, supreme ruler of millions. And yet, you can't even pick who shares your bed without permission. You've got thousands of women in your harem, but zero freedom. Every night is a ceremony. Every desire is logged, timed, reviewed, and, yep, watched from the other side of the curtain. So don't get too cozy on that jade pillow just yet. Because tonight, we're peeling back the silk on one of the most tightly controlled, ritual-heavy, and bizarrely bureaucratic love systems in history. This isn't just ancient gossip. It's cosmic duty, coded pleasure, and dangerous politics rolled into one silk-covered burrito of a bedtime routine. Under the burning sun of ancient China, behind the vermilion walls of the Forbidden City, there lived a man who was more than a ruler. He was a symbol, a legend, a divine presence cloaked in silk and ceremony. The Son of Heaven, they called him. To the outside world, the emperor had everything: infinite power, unimaginable wealth, and the admiration of millions. But within the labyrinth of polished courtyards and shadowed corridors, he was also a prisoner, shackled not by chains, but by tradition, ritual, and expectation. And nowhere was this more evident than in the most intimate part of his existence. In the West, the private life of a monarch might be whispered about in scandal sheets or memoirs. In imperial China, however, intimacy was neither private nor casual. It was governed by cosmic forces, political agendas, and ancient doctrines. The emperor's desire wasn't his own to follow. It was regulated like the imperial calendar, mapped across scrolls with precision and authority. Even his longing was subject to the stars. From the moment he ascended the dragon throne, his body no longer belonged to himself. It became an extension of the state, a living conduit through which dynastic continuity was to be secured. His romantic encounters were recorded, scheduled, and sanctioned. They were acts of national importance, each one potentially bearing the next link in the celestial chain of succession. A whisper of spontaneity would be considered dangerous, chaos in a world obsessed with harmony. Each nightfall in the Forbidden City brought with it not freedom, but protocol. When the emperor was to be accompanied, the process began not in his mind, but in the Bureau of Palace Affairs. There, officials would consult a thick registry of consorts and concubines, cross-referencing celestial alignments, ancestral birthdays, and dynastic obligations. It wasn't enough to simply be beautiful. A woman's heritage, her house's political standing, and the fortune cast by the stars all played a role in determining whether she would be summoned. Once chosen, her name was etched onto a slender wooden plaque, a nameplate of fate, and placed into a silver tray alongside others. These were presented to the emperor, not for random selection, but as a symbolic gesture. In truth, even the moment of supposed choice was a stage in a play whose script had been rehearsed for generations. Should he nod toward a plaque, it would be whisked away by eunuchs who would oversee every step of what followed. The concubine would be bathed to perfume and clothed in designated silk garments. Her arrival to the emperor's quarters was ritualistic, sometimes carried on the back of a eunuch, sometimes walking in silence, always preceded by incense. But the moment was not hers, and it certainly wasn't his. It was the empire's, and those in charge of safeguarding its purity took that role with a seriousness bordering on the surreal. Inside his private chambers, the emperor stood not as a man, but as a vessel of legacy. Emotions were secondary, duty was paramount. Even the act itself was monitored, not directly but meticulously reported. Eunuchs recorded timing, outcomes, and even the state of the emperor's health afterward. The logs would then be sealed and archived. If the encounter led to conception, the ramifications echoed across the empire like the tolling of a ceremonial bell. But what if the emperor felt nothing? What if his heart pulled him in a different direction? What if he longed not for the chosen woman, but for solitude, or for someone forbidden by birth or class? These questions were silenced before they could form. To serve heaven was to erase the self, and that included desires, frustrations, even loneliness. His heart, like the gardens of the palace, was curated, trimmed, controlled. Even in this sea of control, the Forbidden City itself stood as the most potent metaphor. Built with nearly 1,000 rooms, it was a place of architectural perfection and spiritual design. Yet within its walls, the most powerful man in the world could not choose freely with whom to share a moment of closeness. He could not wander through the maze of red-painted corridors and whisper his longing into the ear of someone unexpected. Every movement was watched, every door had ears, every night was predetermined. And so, beneath the layers of embroidered robes and jade ornaments, a paradox pulsed at the heart of the empire. The emperor was divine, yet bound, worshipped, yet regulated, desired, yet detached. His nights were not a retreat from duty, but an extension of it. In the hush of his bedchamber, silence ruled louder than any cry of affection. And as the moonlight slanted across lacquered floors, he lay not in embrace, but in ceremony, the most intimate act in the empire, reduced to a line in a bureaucrat's scroll. What the world imagined as indulgence was, in truth, a meticulously scripted illusion, a gilded cage built not of steel, but of expectation and law. And this was only the beginning, because behind that first ritual, that first controlled night, stretched a lifetime of nights exactly like it, each one weighted with obligation, each one drawing the emperor further from himself. The word harem often conjures exotic fantasies, a secluded paradise filled with silken pillows, quiet laughter, and indulgent pleasures. But in the world of Chinese emperors, this fantasy couldn't have been further from reality. The imperial harem was not a private playground. It was a state apparatus, a machine built not for romance, but for control, over lineage, over loyalty, and over the throne itself. It was less about desire and more about strategy, and every woman who passed through its gates did so not merely as a companion, but as a potential piece on a vast political chessboard. The numbers alone were staggering. At its peak, a Chinese emperor could command a harem of over 3,000 women. They didn't arrive all at once, nor by accident. Every one of them was selected, evaluated, and assigned a rank according to strict imperial hierarchy. Their beauty was noted, yes, but so were their family names, ancestral ties, and political usefulness. The harem was a living archive of dynastic alliances. daughters of generals, sisters of ministers, distant cousins of noble families, all sent into the palace not to find love, but to plant a flag. Being chosen wasn't the beginning of a fairy tale. It was the start of a life of isolation and maneuvering. These women were removed from the world they knew, often as young girls, and brought behind the closed doors of the Forbidden City. Once inside, they became property of the emperor, not in sentiment, but in law. Their lives revolved around rules, where they could walk, whom they could speak to, how they addressed others, and what they wore. Every thread of silk on their robes symbolized status. Every missed bow could mean demotion or punishment. The ranks within the harem were obsessively detailed. At the top sat the empress, the legal wife of the emperor, elevated above all others, but often politically appointed and emotionally distant. Below her were the imperial consorts, noble ladies, and a dizzying variety of titled ranks with names like worthy lady or talented woman. Each rank carried privileges, access to certain gardens, private maids, or even specific times of day when they could be summoned to appear before the emperor. But the most precious currency inside the harem wasn't a jeweled hairpin or a golden bracelet. It was proximity. To be noticed by the emperor, to be chosen, even once, elevated a woman's status overnight. Her rank could leap upward. Her family could receive titles or lands. A single successful night might mean not just personal advancement, but the elevation of an entire clan. That kind of opportunity bred ambition, jealousy, and treachery in equal measure. Yet not every woman was truly seen. Many lived their entire lives behind those palace walls without once being summoned. They spent decades in quiet waiting, embroidering, studying poetry, reciting ancient texts, their lives ticking by like incense smoke curling through the latticework. Forgotten by the emperor, unknown to the world outside, their beauty faded before it was ever witnessed. The stakes were immense. To be chosen could mean safety. To be ignored meant fading into obscurity, living out one's days in luxurious silence, but with a gnawing sense of being forgotten. And with so many women vying for so little attention, alliances formed. Factions emerged. Even though the harem was governed by strict codes, power games unfolded beneath the surface, subtle glances, coded language, secret letters delivered by trusted eunuchs. It was politics cloaked in silk. Sometimes, the emperor's attention was genuine, sparked by curiosity, affection, or even love. But more often, it was curated. The Bureau of Imperial Household managed rotations, recommending who should be presented and when. These suggestions weren't neutral. They reflected which families were in favor, what political debts needed repaying, or which factions needed to be quieted. Even in intimacy, the emperor acted through layers of bureaucracy. To the women, being selected wasn't merely an honor. It could be a risk. A favored consort attracted envy. Poisonings were not unheard of. Rumors, whispered slanders, or manufactured scandals could destroy reputations overnight. Behind each pearl earring and graceful smile, there was the knowledge that safety lay only in balance, visible enough to matter, but not so powerful as to inspire resentment. Ironically, in a palace filled with thousands of women, true connection was nearly impossible. The emperor rarely had time for more than fleeting encounters. His nights were planned weeks ahead, and time with any single woman was limited. Sometimes the intimacy lasted only minutes, followed by silence, a recorded report, and a return to isolation. The man who seemed to have every woman at his feet was in truth a man of routine, ritual, and detachment. In this system, emotion became a liability. Affection could cloud judgment. Attachment could incite instability. And yet, humans remained human. Secret love bloomed, forbidden relationships flourished in shadows, and hearts broke quietly behind painted fans and embroidered veils. For the emperor, each night was another calculation. For the women, each breath was a game of survival. The harem was not a dream. It was a dynasty's engine, humming beneath the surface of power, its moving parts disguised in beauty and grace. And in the midst of it all, real lives unfolded, shaped by rules too ancient to question and desires too dangerous to admit. Choice in the Forbidden City was an illusion, especially for the one man who seemed to hold all power. The emperor, the apex of civilization, divine ruler of all under heaven, could not simply choose who would share his bed on any given night. His most private moments were not governed by passion or whim, but by a committee, a constellation of eunuchs, clerks, and astrologers orchestrated each night with the same precision they used to plot military campaigns or schedule imperial audiences. Nothing about his intimacy was left to chance, and absolutely nothing was spontaneous. At the center of this machinery stood a deceptively simple object, a small red sandalwood plaque. It was smooth, engraved with a woman's name, and often bore symbols denoting her status, clan, and palace origin. But it held immense power. These plaques were not trophies, nor tokens of affection. They were tools of the state, shuffled and arranged with bureaucratic calculation. Every evening, a eunuch from the Bureau of Ceremonial Affairs would arrive bearing a tray, sometimes lacquered, sometimes silver-plated, filled with dozens of these plaques. The emperor would appear to make a selection. He might pause, glance, even frown, but often the choice had already been made for him long before the tray reached his table. The eunuch might subtly tilt one plaque toward him. Another might mysteriously disappear from the set. These gestures were coded suggestions, orchestrated behind the scenes by court factions, political necessity, or astrological guidance. Yes, the stars played a role. Imperial astrologers consulted the lunar calendar, calculated auspicious dates, and examined the alignment of constellations before anyone dared suggest a consort. It was believed that certain nights, specific to each woman's birth date and family lineage, were more favorable for interaction. A night deemed inauspicious could not proceed, no matter the emperor's personal desire. Harmony between heaven and earth, after all, began in the bedroom. Behind these calculations lay a deeper motive: preservation of the dynasty. Every act of intimacy carried the possibility of creating an heir. Therefore, it needed to be documented, supervised, and above all, regulated. If a son were born on a day unblessed by the stars, it could cast doubt on his legitimacy, or worse, be seen as a cosmic warning. That kind of risk was unacceptable, so the Bureau took control of timing, of selection, and even of preparation. Once the plaque was selected, eunuchs set into motion a carefully rehearsed routine. The chosen woman, whether a high-ranking consort or a rarely summoned concubine, would be informed hours in advance. She would be bathed in perfumed water, dressed in ceremonial night robes, sometimes prescribed in color and style, and her hair arranged according to status. She wasn't allowed to speak to anyone not assigned to her direct service during this period. Silence and obedience were the expected graces. Then came the most symbolic and strange part of the ritual. To prevent any suspicion of deception, the woman would be physically carried, sometimes nude, sometimes in a thin ceremonial wrap, on the back of a eunuch to the emperor's chambers. This was not done out of cruelty or humiliation, but out of fear. Fear that she might pick up something on the way. A talisman, a drug, a hidden object. By transporting her in this way, palace authorities ensured she brought nothing with her but her own body. Once inside the emperor's room, she was expected to bow, to remain still, and to follow his lead without question. Yet even then, the act was not entirely private. Outside the doors, eunuchs waited, clocks ticked, and bureaucrats prepared the necessary record scrolls. After the meeting ended, whether after minutes or hours, a report was drafted, signed, and sealed. It noted the woman's name, the date, the time of entry and exit, and a coded note about whether the encounter was fruitful or neutral. This document would then be archived in the palace vaults alongside thousands of similar entries. For the emperor, these encounters often blurred together. The same rituals, repeated with different faces. He could not express favoritism too openly, lest it stir unrest. Nor could he ignore the rotation suggested by the eunuchs, many of whom served powerful court cliques. To resist their scheduling might appear harmless at first, but over time, such resistance would signal political favoritism or personal disobedience to heavenly order. Even more telling was the emperor's vulnerability in this system. The man believed to be above all others had little say over his own solitude or longing. If he wished to abstain, to be alone, to delay a scheduled meeting, he needed to provide a reason, and not just any excuse, a legitimate one, backed by his physician or a counselor. Desire was not a private matter, but a managed function of the state. Those red plaques, stacked and shuffled, bore witness to centuries of these decisions. Silent wooden tokens, each one a story half told, of women hopeful and terrified, of emperors exhausted and indifferent, of a civilization so concerned with cosmic order that it forgot the chaos of human yearning. In this web of ritual and oversight, intimacy was dissected until it became indistinguishable from ceremony. The emperor might lie beside someone, but never truly with them. Not when every breath was measured, every gesture recorded, and every night curated by unseen hands that worked not for pleasure, but for posterity. In the palaces of the Forbidden City, desire didn't flow like water. It moved in precise lunar arcs, charted by ancient formulas and mapped across scrolls inscribed with gold dust and ink. To the uninitiated, the imperial bedroom might seem like the only place where instinct was allowed to break protocol, where the Son of Heaven could act on impulse, free from the weight of the world. But that was an illusion. Even passion was tied to the stars. Behind every meeting, every breath of closeness was a constellation of numbers, dates, and cosmic permission. The emperor's intimate life was bound not by longing, but by timing, and timing in the imperial court meant the calendar. Not just any calendar, but a vast, complex system derived from Taoist principles, Confucian ethics, and astrological mathematics. Days were divided not only by sun and moon, but by heavenly stems and earthly branches, elements and animal signs, solar terms and auspicious hours. And at the core of this cosmic labyrinth was one dominant force, the moon. The lunar cycle was sacred. Each phase represented a shift in energy, a different alignment of yin and yang. Certain nights were considered rich, with harmonious energy for producing strong male heirs. Others were believed to drain vitality or encourage instability. The emperor, believed to be the earthly embodiment of cosmic order, could not afford to violate the rhythm of the heavens. Doing so might invite disharmony into the palace or into the entire empire. Thus, before a woman could be summoned to his chamber, her birth date was examined with almost mystical seriousness. Astrologers compared her 8-character horoscope, known as Bazi, with the emperor's own. These 8 characters, derived from the exact year, month, day, and hour of birth, were believed to reveal a person's fate, compatibility, and energetic alignment. If her elemental makeup clashed with his, if fire met water in opposition, or earth suffocated air, she was quietly removed from the list for that evening. But that wasn't all. The season mattered. Spring nights were often reserved for consorts born in the fall to balance the heat and chill of their inherent energy. Even the direction of the wind, the scent in the air, or the color of the moon could alter the decision. A sudden storm might cancel a night. A comet's appearance might delay plans for a week. These were not superstitions. They were law. The Bureau of Astronomy and the Ministry of Rites worked together like surgeons, slicing the year into windows of possibility. They maintained elaborate charts where names of consorts were written beside numbered codes that marked their auspicious days. These charts were updated with each new celestial event, each seasonal shift, and each health report from the imperial physicians. No woman was summoned without their recommendation. And so, many waited for years for that one night, a rare moment when their stars aligned, their health permitted, and the emperor's mood coincided with the moon's favor. Imagine living in a palace, dressed in silks, surrounded by elegance, and yet knowing that your worth, your visibility, depended not on love or even beauty, but on a formula older than the empire itself. Once selected, the woman's information was logged into the Imperial Intimacy Register, a meticulously guarded journal kept in the Hall of Celestial Purity. It recorded not only her name and background, but the precise hour she was born, the astrological calculation that approved her visit, the lunar phase, and the outcome of the encounter. If she conceived, it was noted. If not, a symbol was marked beside her name, a quiet warning that her window of cosmic opportunity might be closing. Why such detail? Because in China, the line between the spiritual and the administrative blurred. Every heir had to be legitimate not only by law, but by the heavens. If a prince was born on a cursed date or during a lunar eclipse, he might be viewed as unfit for succession, no matter how beloved or talented. Legitimacy wasn't just a matter of birth, it was a matter of fate, and fate was something no emperor dared ignore. This obsession with numbers extended even to the nights themselves. Some emperors were known to keep tally of their partners, ensuring a symbolic balance. 7 women from each of the cardinal palaces, or 1 for each of the 28 lunar mansions. The idea was not indulgence, but harmony. The emperor was not just a man. He was the axis around which the world turned. If his choices grew imbalanced, the seasons might falter, the crops might fail, rebellions might rise. And so, behind the closed doors of the Forbidden City, where silk whispered over stone and candles flickered against dragon-painted walls, passion waited its turn like everything else. The Emperor may have ruled the earth, but the sky ruled him. Every desire had to be timed, every night forecast. This was not intimacy as we know it. This was a cosmic ritual, a negotiation between man and heaven. And the women who were part of it, who lived in expectation, in silence, in the hope of being chosen on the perfect day, were less companions than participants in a vast celestial equation, each one reduced to a line in a chart, a number in a cycle, a name on a page, waiting for the moon to grant her moment. They were everywhere, and yet they belonged nowhere. Silent shadows gliding through palace halls, dressed in muted robes and bearing the soft scent of incense, eunuchs were neither men nor women in the eyes of the court. But in the world behind the golden screens, in the intricate machinery of the imperial bedroom, they were kings of discretion and gatekeepers of power. To understand the private life of a Chinese emperor is to understand the men who managed it, monitored it, and ultimately controlled it, the eunuchs. To outsiders, a eunuch might seem like a servant, a figure of pity or irrelevance, defined by what had been taken from him. But within the Forbidden City, this was a dangerous misreading. Eunuchs were not just part of the system, they were the system. They guarded the harem, selected the women, documented the acts, and more disturbingly to modern eyes, sometimes witnessed what took place behind the veil of intimacy. They had access no general, no minister, no scholar could dream of. And in that access lay their unmatched influence. Their origins were often tragic. Many had been sold by poor families, others taken as tribute or punishment. The transformation they endured, physically and socially, was brutal and irreversible. Yet paradoxically, that very transformation made them powerful. Because they could no longer father children or form traditional family alliances, they were considered safe, safe to be around thousands of young women, safe to guard the emperor's secrets, safe to be entrusted with the most private matters of the throne. But this safety was a mask. Eunuchs, stripped of the usual means to climb the ladder of legacy, redirected all ambition into the only arena left to them, influence, an influence they had in abundance, especially in the harem. The day began and ended with their presence. When a consort was selected for an imperial night, it was a eunuch who carried the news. It was he who prepared her, overseeing her bath, inspecting her robes, ensuring she carried no charms or contraband that could interfere with fate or fertility. It was he who carried her, literally across his back or in his arms, to the emperor's chambers. A moment steeped in ceremony, but also in symbolic submission. Not only from the woman, but from the emperor himself, who had surrendered choice to the structure the eunuchs maintained. Their roles didn't stop at the doorway. Though no one officially observed the emperor's moments of intimacy, eunuchs often stood just outside, ready to take notes, discreet, coded entries in the intimacy register. In certain eras, it was even said that a trusted chief eunuch might discreetly observe through hidden panels or curtain gaps to ensure the encounter proceeded as required, for timing, legitimacy, or evidence. These weren't voyeuristic acts, they were administrative ones. In the eyes of the court, the emperor's bedroom was as official a space as his throne room. And yet, the line between serving and ruling blurred dangerously. With no family to anchor them, eunuchs formed their own internal hierarchies. The chief eunuch, in particular, could become the second most powerful man in China, or, in times of weak emperors, the most powerful. He controlled access to the inner palace. He controlled information. And crucially, he controlled the body of the emperor himself. When he rested, what he ate, who touched him. This intimacy gave rise to a quiet tyranny. Factions formed within the eunuch ranks. Bribes flowed. A family might send secret gifts, not to the emperor, but to the eunuch who managed the bedroom roster. A consort might curry favor, not by charm, but by securing the silent support of the man who carried her plaque. Loaves rose and fell on a whisper. And the emperor, he often never knew. Not all eunuchs abused their position. Some were deeply loyal, dedicating their lives to protecting the emperor and upholding the order of the court. But the system itself was dangerous. It placed immense, unsupervised power in the hands of men who had been mutilated and discarded by society, then resurrected as arbiters of the most sensitive domain of imperial life. Resentment brewed quietly in many of them, and power in such hands often turned corrosive. The paradox was inescapable. The emperor, believed to be the most powerful man alive, was flanked at all times by men who had no official rank, no family, no dynasty. Yet they knew his every habit, every weakness, every secret. And in the end, they were the ones who decided which woman warmed his bed, which rumor reached his ears, and which heir carried his name. Were they servants? Technically, yes, but in reality, they were much more. They were priests of ritual, brokers of favor, and sometimes puppeteers cloaked in humility. Stripped of one kind of manhood, they had built another, more cunning, more durable, and infinitely more dangerous. In the echoing silence of the Forbidden City, they walked quietly. But history remembers how loudly their silence ruled. He was still a boy, barely taller than the armrest of the dragon throne. His voice had not yet deepened, his fingers still clumsy with calligraphy. And yet, the moment the crown touched his head, the expectations of 1,000 ancestors, ministers, and silent watchers descended upon him. The empire called him Emperor, Son of Heaven. But in the flickering candlelight of the inner palace, where duty took on its most invasive form, he was something else entirely, an unprepared child expected to perform a man's ritual. The history of imperial China is filled with rulers who ascended the throne in adolescence, some as young as 6 or 7. Their rule may have been supervised by regents or empress dowagers, but one area of life could not wait: the continuation of the bloodline. For the stability of the dynasty, it was essential that even the youngest emperor begin fulfilling the expectations of legacy. And so, long before they understood what intimacy meant, they were pushed toward it, not with affection, but with formality. Their first experience was not an exploration of self or heart. It was a ceremonial task, a state requirement, a date circled in red ink by men who cared more about timing than tenderness. The preparations began with lessons, not in love or connection, but in imperial bedroom etiquette. These boys, still studying Confucian classics and learning how to bow properly, were handed scrolls describing the rules of the bedchamber. They were lectured on how to preserve energy, how to perform efficiently, and how to avoid spiritual imbalance. Elder eunuchs, often in their 60s or 70s, served as tutors in these lessons, speaking with clinical detachment about what must happen and why. There was no room for awkwardness or hesitation, no time to wonder if they were ready. The court needed results, and so a day was chosen. An auspicious hour was calculated by astrologers, and the emperor's body was readied as if it were a ceremonial vessel. He would be bathed, robed, and led to his private chamber. Meanwhile, the chosen consort, often a girl not much older, herself trained in submission and composure, was prepared separately. She, too, had been groomed for this moment, coached on when to kneel, how to speak, what to feel, or rather, what not to feel. The first night, then, was not a meeting of equals, nor a moment of curiosity or vulnerability. It was an assignment, and disturbingly, it was one often observed, not directly, but administratively. Just outside the chamber doors, high-ranking eunuchs or court officials would wait, scrolls in hand, ready to log the time the emperor entered and exited, whether the act was successful, and whether the chosen partner exhibited signs of conception. This was not voyeurism. This was statecraft, and it left no room for privacy. The psychological weight of such a moment cannot be overstated. For a young boy, unsure of his own body, still forming ideas of trust and power, to be placed in such a situation, surrounded by silence, pressure, and the invisible eyes of the empire, was not a rite of passage. It was a fracture, a moment where selfhood was overwritten by role, where uncertainty could not be expressed, and fear was buried beneath layers of protocol and gold-threaded silk. Many of these emperors bore the scars silently. They were not allowed to speak of discomfort. There was no vocabulary for confusion, no safe space for refusal. Their feelings were irrelevant to the system that demanded performance. And so, some withdrew emotionally. Others became obsessed with ritual, replacing feeling with precision. A few rebelled later in life, seeking connection in unapproved places with maids, actors, or even forbidden companions, desperate to reclaim what had been taken from them that first night. Those early experiences shaped entire reigns. An emperor who felt nothing during his initiation might become distant and cold, treating relationships as transactions. Another might become overly attached to the first woman who showed him kindness, elevating her far beyond her station, causing political imbalance. Still others grew cruel, repeating the cycle of emotional detachment on the next generation of concubines, creating dynasties of unresolved hurt masked by protocol. And yet, for all the trauma encoded into this ritual, it was never questioned. No advisor stepped forward to say, "He is not ready." No official proposed a delay. The system was too old, too revered, too convinced that the stars, the scrolls, and the ceremony knew better than the boy himself. So the emperor, still a child in body and soul, learned early what it meant to be alone, even while surrounded by hundreds. He learned that touch could be a duty, not a comfort, that longing must bow to law, and that his own heart was not his to protect, but a tool to be wielded by the invisible hands of tradition. In the hush of those first nights, history often speaks of dynastic continuation, of ritual fulfilled, of balance preserved. but it rarely speaks of the silence inside the emperor's chest, the moment he realized that his body was not truly his own, that his first experience, far from tender or transformative, was simply another ceremony in a palace where even childhood had no refuge. In the shimmering halls of the Forbidden City, intimacy was never merely physical, it was metaphysical, a delicate transaction of energies that, if performed correctly, could lead to strength, clarity, and even something approaching immortality. To the emperor, every encounter was more than a moment of closeness. It was a ritual steeped in ancient philosophy, rooted in the balance of the universe itself. And at the heart of this belief lay a concept older than the dynasty, the dual forces of yin and yang. Yin and yang were not just abstract symbols etched into scrolls or painted on temple walls. They were living, breathing principles that governed every corner of imperial life. Yang represented masculinity, warmth, light, and activity. Yin embodied femininity, coolness, darkness, and receptivity. For harmony to exist in the cosmos, these two forces had to remain in dynamic balance, and the emperor, as the son of heaven, was expected to embody that balance in his every action, including the most private. But there was a twist. According to Taoist tradition, yang energy was precious, finite. A man was born with a limited store of it, and each intimate release depleted that reserve. To lose too much was to weaken the body, cloud the mind, and shorten life. To conserve it, on the other hand, to refine and redirect it, was to gain vitality, spiritual clarity, and potentially transcend death itself. This belief transformed the emperor's most intimate acts into something far more intense, acts of inner alchemy. Taoist texts circulated secretly among the emperor's medical advisors, and palace scholars described this practice in detail. A successful ruler, they said, did not waste his essence. Instead, he learned to circulate his internal energy through breathing, meditation, and astonishingly, restraint. It was believed that the act of being with a partner, particularly one with abundant yin energy, could refresh the emperor's own yang force if he refrained from releasing his own. The more yin he absorbed without loss, the more powerful he became. This belief gave rise to a strange and often misunderstood tradition, the idea that an emperor's strength could be increased not by conquest or study, but through controlled intimacy with multiple partners, without reaching release himself. Manuals were written on how to draw in the partner's energy, how to regulate the breath, where to direct the flow of qi, life force, and even how to visualize the golden elixir forming in the lower abdomen, a mystical substance said to fuel long life and spiritual ascension. Some emperors took this philosophy to heart, turning the bedroom into a training ground for spiritual discipline. They would engage with partners, sometimes several in a night, not for indulgence but for energy cultivation. Success was measured not in pleasure, but in how well they could resist it. And failure, the involuntary loss of energy, was seen as a leak in the emperor's cosmic vessel. Repeated losses were thought to bring lethargy, confusion, or susceptibility to illness. An emperor who lost control too often was considered spiritually vulnerable and politically weakened. This idea created enormous pressure. The emperor was expected not only to maintain political order, but also to protect his internal balance. Every misstep, every moment of bodily indulgence, was viewed as a crack in the harmony between heaven and earth. palace physicians kept meticulous logs of the emperor's energy, diet, and physical responses. They prescribed herbs, tonics, breathing exercises, all intended to preserve the sacred seed, the Jing, which was seen as the root of all health and destiny. The implications went even deeper. If the emperor's energy was unstable, it could influence everything from military fortunes to agricultural success. The health of the state and the fertility of the land were symbolically tied to his own internal condition. If he grew tired, confused, or frequently ill, whispers might begin among the ministers. Had he overindulged? Had he failed in his Taoist duties? And worse, had he allowed desire to cloud the mandate of heaven? To prevent this, elaborate systems were developed. Intimacy was tracked. Records were kept. And behind closed doors, the emperor was surrounded not by softness, but by supervision. Eunuchs who watched the clock, physicians who monitored the aftermath, and advisors who read his aura for signs of depletion. But for all the pressure to remain in control, emperors were still human. Some embraced the doctrine of energy retention as a path to power and health. Others saw it as a cruel denial of the very connection they craved. A few rebelled, immersing themselves in pleasure despite the warnings, burning bright and fast, and earning reputations as decadent or cursed. In this alchemical worldview, intimacy was not sin, nor was it joy. It was a test, a tightrope walk between power and vulnerability, between indulgence and immortality. The emperor was told that the key to long life was not love, nor connection, but containment. That the act of being close could be transcendent, but only if he could master himself in the moment of greatest temptation. So night after night, behind golden doors and incense-sweetened air, the most powerful man in the world entered his chamber not seeking affection, but preparing for battle, not against an enemy, but against his own body. To triumph was to grow stronger. To fail was to lose more than just control, and it was to leak power into the air, and with it, a piece of his divine right to rule. Behind the high walls of the Forbidden City, beyond the splendor of imperial halls, and beneath the silence of jade dragons, another kind of education took place, one never discussed in public, never acknowledged in records, and yet considered vital to the future of the dynasty. This was not the study of statecraft or military strategy. It was the training of the emperor's most private discipline, the mastery of the self within the sacred boundaries of the bedchamber. And for the young heirs of the dragon throne, this training began long before they understood its meaning. In a culture where balance was everything and the emperor was believed to be the earthly mirror of celestial harmony, his personal energy was not merely his own. It was a reservoir of cosmic force, a link between heaven and earth. To waste it was to weaken the empire. To channel it was to strengthen the divine order. And so, when a young prince was designated heir, one of the earliest and most secretive forms of instruction he received was in the art of internal cultivation, a discipline both physical and spiritual, often cloaked in the language of ritual, never desire. The training began in seclusion. A private wing of the palace, far from the noise of courtiers and ministers, was set aside for this purpose. The boy would be introduced to texts written in veiled metaphors, Taoist manuals that spoke of jade stems and golden gates, heavenly dew and immortal essence. At first glance, they read like poetry. In reality, they were blueprints for control. These ancient treatises detailed how a ruler should regulate his breath, posture, heartbeat, and body temperature in preparation for physical union. They were not written to inspire passion, but to suppress it. The young prince would be taught to meditate for hours at a time, focusing on the movement of qi, the vital energy said to circulate through invisible channels in the body. Breathing techniques were drilled into him. Inhale through the nose, draw the breath into the lower abdomen, hold it, release slowly, over and over until it became instinct. His teachers, often elderly Taoist monks or trusted eunuchs, would correct the slightest deviation. If his shoulders rose, he had failed. If his mind wandered, he was sent back to start again. In addition to meditation, he practiced physical exercises rooted in ancient martial traditions. These were not about combat, but about control of muscles, of breath, of the body's natural reflexes. Movements were slow and deliberate, with postures that mimicked flowing water or the stillness of a mountain. Every motion had a purpose: to increase stamina, to harness energy, to delay the moment of release, or avoid it entirely. Perhaps the most mystifying part of this training was the emphasis on retention. The heir was taught that during intimacy, the goal was not to surrender, but to absorb, to draw in the partner's yin energy while preserving his own yang. He was warned that releasing his essence too early or too often would deplete his life force, that it would age him prematurely, cloud his judgment, and invite misfortune. In a world obsessed with omens, these warnings had the weight of prophecy. To reinforce these teachings, the heir was sometimes required to engage in guided visualizations. He would be told to imagine golden light coiling within his belly, circulating through his spine, pooling behind his forehead. Some were taught to silently recite mantras while in the presence of a partner, not for religious comfort, but to maintain mental discipline and resist instinct. In extreme cases, some rulers underwent early encounters, not with partners of their choosing, but with carefully selected women considered spiritually neutral, vessels for training, not affection. And throughout all of this, the emphasis was clear. This was not about pleasure. In fact, pleasure was seen as dangerous, a weakness, a threat to clarity and command. The young emperor was not learning how to enjoy his body. He was learning how to command it, to separate sensation from impulse, to rule over his own instincts with the same authority he would someday wield over millions. These lessons left deep marks. Some emperors emerged from them as disciplined, emotionally distant rulers, masters of formality, but strangers to intimacy. Others, raised to fear their own natural urges, grew detached from affection entirely, turning their focus to ritual, legacy, or the perfection of routine. A few, in secret, rebelled, seeking forbidden experiences, driven by the quiet hunger to feel something unprescribed. But none escaped the weight of the training. It followed them into adulthood, into every scheduled night, into every gaze cast upon a concubine or empress. The teachings whispered in their minds like ghosts: control, retain, absorb, do not lose. And so the imperial bedroom became another throne room, a place of performance, expectation, and governance. The emperor might have appeared relaxed, charming, or even affectionate, but beneath the surface he was calculating his breath, monitoring his qi, recalling lines from old scrolls written in ink long faded. His body, once his own, had become a temple of balance and a weapon of continuity. There was no room for vulnerability in such a world, no space for clumsy discovery, for trembling firsts, for laughter or love. The boy who once held a bamboo brush in calligraphy lessons was now expected to script harmony with his very being, to become not just a man, but a myth, sculpted by silence and shaped by control. Inside the imperial palace, even passion wore robes of protocol. Where others might imagine intimacy as a moment of freedom, of laughter, spontaneity, or emotion, the emperor's private world offered none of that. His bedchamber, despite its silk-draped walls and sandalwood scent, was not a sanctuary of connection. It was a stage, a space so burdened by expectation, belief, and regulation that every movement, every breath, was choreographed to serve not desire, but doctrine. Confucian philosophy, which governed nearly every facet of imperial Chinese life, extended its influence deep into the most personal recesses of existence, including the bedroom. This ancient system valued order above all else. It believed that harmony in the family mirrored harmony in the state. And if the emperor's role was to model perfect virtue, then his most private moments had to reflect that same discipline. The proper intimate act, according to Confucian-influenced codes and interpretations, was not a celebration of feeling. It was a solemn duty. It had structure, hierarchy, and most astonishingly, rules. Laughter, discouraged. It implied frivolity. Loud noises, forbidden. They suggested loss of control. Improvisation, dangerous. It hinted at indulgence, chaos, and, worst of all, the surrender of reason to emotion. The consort, no matter her rank or favor, was expected to maintain silence unless spoken to. She was instructed not to meet the emperor's gaze directly unless invited. Her gestures were meant to be graceful but subdued, her voice soft, her body still unless directed otherwise. The emperor, in turn, was expected to lead with restraint. His movements had to be measured, his demeanor calm. To lose himself in the moment would be seen as a lapse in virtue, a crack in the image of the wise ruler. Even positioning was dictated by custom. There existed a preferred posture, one said to align the energies of yin and yang most harmoniously. Deviating from it required justification, either a medical reason or specific advice from palace physicians or Taoist counselors. To suggest a change mid-act could be interpreted as presumptuous, even disrespectful. Spontaneity in this world was not romantic. It was disorderly. Overseeing this intricate ballet were the silent enforcers of decorum, the eunuchs. Though they never entered during the act itself, their presence loomed like shadows in the next room. They prepared the space, recorded the time of entry, noted the condition of the consort, and waited just beyond the curtains to log the outcome. If the emperor chose to linger too long, they might gently signal the passage of time. If a sound, a laugh, a gasp, an argument escaped the chamber, it was remembered, not necessarily punished, but recorded, discussed, interpreted. There was no such thing as a private night in the Forbidden City. Palace physicians played their part as well. They would be consulted in advance to ensure the emperor's energy was stable and the chosen consort's health conducive to the meeting. Afterward, they might examine both parties for signs of imbalance: a flushed face, an irregular pulse, a drop in appetite. These observations would be compiled into a report sent to the Bureau of Internal Affairs, where it would be reviewed in the context of astrology, energy theory, and seasonal balance. A night that was too passionate could be deemed risky. A night that seemed cold, equally concerning. Why such scrutiny? Because the emperor's body was a symbol. His composure reflected the stability of the empire. If he grew reckless, indulgent, or emotionally entangled, it was feared that natural disasters, uprisings, or political instability would follow. The ancients believed that heaven communicated through signs, and an undisciplined emperor was the surest sign of all that something had gone wrong in the celestial order. The result of all this was an intimacy drained of tenderness. What might have been a private connection became another ceremony, one that began with a wooden plaque and ended with a brushstroke in the imperial register. The consort returned to her quarters without fanfare. The emperor dressed in silence. The room was quietly cleaned, and the next day, life resumed as if nothing had happened, because, according to the palace, nothing had. Not in the way the outside world understood it. Yet behind the formality, there remained a trace of something more human. In whispered conversations between servants, in the glance of a concubine as she waited to be chosen again, in the pause of the emperor as he stared at the moon through his lattice window, perhaps there was a flicker of longing for what might have been had the rules not been so rigid, for a moment of real warmth, not measured by scrolls or watched by shadows, for the simple, chaotic grace of being human, something that even the Son of Heaven, despite all his power, was rarely allowed to feel. In the vast, echoing halls of the Forbidden City, affection was never simple. It was coded, calculated, and above all, dangerous. A mere glance from the emperor could raise a woman from obscurity to unrivaled influence. But the same glance, if repeated too often, could destabilize the entire political architecture of the empire. In a world where hierarchy ruled and emotion was seen as a threat to balance, love, true, personal, irrational love, was the most perilous force of all. The imperial harem was a world of staggering complexity. At first glance, it might seem like a realm of leisure, where women competed for the emperor's attention in hopes of status, comfort, or maternal legacy. But in reality, it was a theater of high-stakes power, and the emperor's favor was the currency. Every time he chose to spend a night with one woman over another, he wasn't just expressing desire. He was tilting the scale of court politics. That's because no consort stood alone. Each woman in the harem, whether she was the daughter of a general, the niece of a governor, or the sister of a provincial lord, represented her family, her clan, her faction. Her rise was their rise, and when the emperor favored her, even privately, it echoed loudly across the court. Positions were granted, military appointments reassigned, trade routes negotiated, all depending on which woman warmed the emperor's chamber most frequently. Naturally, this meant that favoritism could spark envy. Ministers whose daughters or cousins were overlooked grew restless. Rival families began whispering. Some might even accuse the favored woman of sorcery, manipulation, or moral corruption. And so the emperor, no matter how smitten he might become, had to carefully balance his affection. Too much attention to one woman wasn't seen as devotion, it was seen as weakness. A ruler ruled with his head, not his heart. And if his heart betrayed him, others would soon follow. History is littered with examples of imperial favorites whose influence grew too visible. One consort might convince the emperor to delay court meetings. Another might be seen accompanying him too often, or be gifted rare jewelry reserved for nobility. Whispers would swell into rumors, rumors into accusations, and then exile, disgrace, or worse. Even the empress herself, the only legally wedded woman in the emperor's life, had to navigate this minefield. Her role was symbolic, her lineage usually prestigious, but her power could be threatened if a favored concubine gained too much influence. Behind the ornate screens and poetic titles, power games raged silently. A consort who bore a son might suddenly find herself surrounded by loyal allies or targeted by enemies. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this power dynamic was what happened when affection lingered too long. A woman who remained in the emperor's favor for more than a season drew scrutiny. If she was seen again and again walking through the scented corridors toward the inner chamber, her name became a threat. Eunuchs might be bribed to report her habits. Ministers might petition the emperor directly, warning him of imbalance. Not out of concern, but out of fear that her presence had become too steady, that her voice was being heard in matters where it shouldn't. To protect the state, or to appease the court, emperors sometimes had no choice but to distance themselves from the women they cherished. A beloved consort could be reassigned to distant quarters, denied access for months, even ordered to take vows in a temple under the guise of spiritual retreat. Some disappeared entirely, victims of quiet decisions made for the good of the empire. The emperor, surrounded by luxury, often watched helplessly as affection was pried from his hands by ritual, law, and the sharp teeth of bureaucracy. And yet, despite the risks, some emperors could not help themselves. A few allowed love to guide them, to disastrous effect. Dynasties fell when passion overrode reason. Court records tell of rulers who neglected duties, who promoted the relatives of favored women, who allowed rival factions to rot while pleasing a single household. In these cases, the story always ends the same: chaos at court, whispers of curses, and the eventual removal, by force, poison, or decree, of the woman blamed for the emperor's decline. Even in less dramatic cases, affection was never private. Every gesture of warmth was politicized. A smile seen by the wrong person, a gift delivered in view of a rival, a child born at a suspiciously convenient time. The emperor's every personal choice became public currency, traded in the dark corners of the palace. This created a haunting paradox. The most powerful man in the world could not love freely, and the women who might have earned that love lived in constant danger of being too beloved. The very thing they longed for, attention, closeness, permanence, could become their undoing. So they learned to hide their feelings behind perfect posture, to time their tears, to whisper advice without being caught. They became masters of invisible influence, moving the world with a glance, only to vanish when the light grew too hot. Because in the Forbidden City, love was not a gift, it was a liability. And in the game of dynastic survival, even affection had to wear a mask. To enter the emperor's bedchamber was not always a privilege. Sometimes it was a death sentence wrapped in silk. Beneath the golden ceilings of the Forbidden City where beauty seemed to radiate from every polished surface, an invisible war raced, one more ruthless and calculating than any fought on distant battlefields. In the softest places, behind gauzy curtains, beneath embroidered covers, among bowls of lotus soup and tea trays set out at dusk, lived the most dangerous weapons of all: jealousy, ambition, and fear. For the women of the harem, a single night with the emperor could mean fortune, power, or total ruin. And when that much was at stake, no method of sabotage was too cruel, no betrayal too severe. To understand the peril of a visit to the emperor's chamber, one must first understand the stakes. A single encounter, even a fleeting one, could elevate a woman's status, secure land and titles for her family, or even birth the next emperor. But power drawn from affection was fragile and always temporary. The women knew this. So did their families, their servants, and especially their rivals. And in the shadows of jealousy, something darker began to take root. Poison was the preferred weapon. It left no blood, no scream, just silence, illness, and disappearance. It could be hidden in powders, infused in oils, painted onto hair combs, or soaked into undergarments. A woman might fall ill mysteriously days after a triumphant night, her body slowly failing while her enemies smiled politely at court. Sometimes the target was the emperor himself. A rival faction, unable to gain favor, might send a concubine tainted with a slow-acting toxin, hoping to weaken the ruler's mind or remove him entirely. The act would be blamed on her, an unlucky consort who dared to get too close. But poison was only one weapon. Lies, too, had deadly precision. A favorite consort could be accused of sorcery, of seducing the emperor with dark arts, of manipulating his decisions with spells and forbidden charms. Once such a whisper began, it was almost impossible to erase. Ministers might raise concerns, eunuchs might testify to strange rituals, and even if no proof emerged, the damage was done. The emperor, bound by the need to preserve harmony, might send her away, not because he believed the lie, but because belief itself had become dangerous. Blackmail and manipulation were equally potent. A concubine's family might be threatened if she refused to spy on the emperor or relay his moods to a particular faction. Another woman might be coerced into seducing a rival's ally, then exposed in scandal. Love letters were forged, servants were bribed, perfumed handkerchiefs left where they would be discovered, scented not with affection, but with accusation. And then there were the eunuchs, silent, watchful, and never neutral. While many were loyal, others played their own games. They controlled who reached the emperor's chambers, whose names were placed forward, whose visits were accidentally delayed or rescheduled. With a nod or a nudge, they could make a favorite vanish from the emperor's attention, or put an unsuspecting woman in a position of sudden power. Their loyalty was often tied to bribes, promises, or personal vengeance, and in the shadows of the bedchamber, they pulled strings with quiet precision. The women themselves were not helpless. They learned the art of political survival young. A smile could be a shield. A compliment could hide a knife. Alliances formed behind closed doors. One concubine might offer protection to another in exchange for information, or band together to undermine a mutual rival. These friendships were rarely sincere. They were temporary pacts, dissolving the moment one woman gained an advantage. Even the act itself, What was meant to be intimate was watched from afar, not with eyes, but with ears, with timekeepers, with records. If a woman pleased the emperor for too long, others took notice. If she was summoned repeatedly, she became a target. And if she became pregnant, the danger doubled. An unborn heir was a lightning rod for treachery. Herbal concoctions were slipped into her food. Servants vanished. Accidents became more frequent. Few things were more dangerous than carrying the future of the dynasty inside your womb. The emperor, too, was vulnerable. He could never be sure if the woman beside him was there for him or for her family's ambitions. If the softness in her eyes masked a dagger behind her back. In the quiet hours of night, surrounded by supposed comfort, he was at his most exposed. Not even his imperial guards could protect him from a whisper, a touch, a drop of something tasteless in his wine. And yet, the dance continued. Night after night, women entered the bedchamber, not with desire, but with calculation. Some sought security, others vengeance. Most just wanted to survive. The room that should have been sacred was instead a stage for invisible warfare, lit by lanterns and perfumed with danger. In the Forbidden City, the path to power was narrow, winding, and drenched in silence. But in the Emperor's chamber, among pillows and whispered names, it became a cliff's edge. One misstep, one enemy too bold, and a woman could fall, not into exile, but into nothingness. Forgotten, erased, replaced by the next name on the tray of sandalwood plaques. So when a consort approached the emperor's chamber, she did not smile. She braced herself. Because in the palace, the most fatal games were not played in throne rooms or war councils. They were played in the hush of the night, between breath and shadow, between longing and law, between two people and 1,000 unseen enemies watching from the dark. When the doors of the emperor's bedchamber finally closed, and the chosen consort stepped into the golden hush of the inner palace, the outside world may have imagined a moment of privacy, perhaps affection, perhaps something unburdened by politics. But in the Forbidden City, nothing was without witness, not even what happened after the act. In fact, it was the moments that followed which revealed the machinery grinding just beneath the silken surface, a system so precise, so unfeeling, that it could reduce intimacy to ink and ritual. The moment the encounter ended, the emperor would signal with a simple gesture. Instantly, eunuchs entered the outer chamber, carrying warm water infused with rare herbs, presented in carved jade or bronze basins. This wasn't for comfort, it was a purification rite. In the belief systems surrounding the palace, physical closeness was not just biological, it was energetic, spiritual. The emperor, as the vessel of cosmic order, was expected to cleanse himself immediately, not only of the physical traces, but of any lingering yin energy that might cloud his yang vitality. The temperature of the water, its ingredients, sometimes angelica root, chrysanthemum, or powdered jade, were all tailored by imperial physicians based on the time, the season, and even the specific woman he had been with. As he washed, the documentation process had already begun. In a small chamber nearby, a court scribe, usually a trusted eunuch, sat hunched over a parchment scroll, brush in hand, waiting for the information to arrive. Another eunuch, whose role was to quietly monitor the timing, stepped forward and whispered the report, the name of the consort, the time she entered, the time she exited, and any additional observations noted during the preparation or the aftermath. These were not opinions or rumors. They were data, cold, factual, exact. If the emperor had asked for additional incense, it was noted. If the consort showed signs of distress or hesitation, that too was logged. The entry was written in a codified format: date, name, chamber designation, duration of encounter, and, most importantly, a short status mark at the end. There were several of these. A symbol for neutral outcome, meaning no signs of conception. Another for promising alignment, meaning the timing and energy had been favorable, and a rare, coveted mark for likely conception, which would elevate the woman's status within hours. These scrolls were archived in a highly restricted vault, accessible only to a handful of high-ranking court officials and imperial doctors. They were not decorative. They were strategic. Why such detail? Because the emperor's legacy, his bloodline, was a matter of state security. If a child were conceived, the court needed proof of legitimacy. Date, hour, mother's identity, all had to be traceable. It was a protection against false heirs, political fraud, and most subtly, against chaos. A disputed heir was a civil war waiting to happen. A well-documented lineage kept the empire from unraveling. But for the women, the post-visit moment was a silent verdict. No words were spoken, but everything had changed. If she had pleased the emperor, she might be summoned again. If her name reappeared in the charts within a week, she knew she was rising. Her meals might be upgraded. Her chambers cleaned more thoroughly. Her attendants might suddenly seem more respectful. Her family, somewhere far outside the walls, might receive quiet honors or gifts. But if her name vanished from the selection trays, if her next month passed without invitation, she knew she had failed. Some failures were final. A woman who stumbled during preparation, who showed fear, who broke the strict silence expected of her, or who simply did not inspire a second glance, might find herself reassigned, moved to outer quarters, given fewer attendants, her silks downgraded, her evenings quieter. She was still in the palace, yes, still technically a consort, but now she was invisible, a name without relevance. Others disappeared more literally. Not in violence, but in bureaucracy. They were sent to temples under the pretense of spiritual retreat, or they became caretakers of the palace gardens, tending chrysanthemums far from the emperor's gaze. In rare cases, if their presence was politically inconvenient, especially if they had angered a higher-ranking consort, they were accused of imbalance, madness, or breach of protocol. Then they were gone, not publicly punished, but erased. The palace did not like to admit failure, especially in matters so sacred. There were exceptions, of course. Sometimes a woman who was overlooked could return, years later, under new stars, after a reshuffling of factions or the emperor's mood. But that was rare. More often the judgment passed after one night remained final, and no one told her directly. She would know from the silence, from the empty tray, from the absence of footsteps in her hallway. For the emperor, the post-ritual was cleansing. For the court, it was data. But for the woman, often barely more than a girl, it was the silent calculations of worth, measured not in kindness, not in thought, not even in beauty, but in minutes logged on a parchment, in symbols inked by men who would never know her face, in a world where history was made with armies and edicts, The fate of a woman could be decided in the time it took for ink to dry on a scroll. And in the palace that saw everything, even silence was recorded, even stillness had meaning, even a moment of absence left behind a trace, written not in memory, but in the ritual that always came after. By the time the emperor entered his chamber, nothing about the night remained uncertain. The name of the woman had been chosen by court advisors. The hour had been calculated by astrologers. The scent of the room, the position of the moon, even the length of the encounter had all been predetermined by rituals older than the dynasty itself. And so, when the curtain fell shut behind him, what remained for the Son of Heaven to do was not to feel, but to perform. Desire, in such a context, became an illusion, something to be conjured, not experienced. Genuine longing was unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. What the emperor needed was control. And so, he became an actor in his own life, donning not only robes and crowns, but the carefully constructed mask of a man still capable of passion. Even when inside, he felt nothing at all. It began with posture. Imperial manuals on bedchamber conduct instructed emperors to appear energized, focused, and serene, a paradox of disciplined dominance. He was expected to approach his consort with warmth, but never affection, confidence, but not desire. His voice had to be low, deliberate. Too soft was weakness, too loud, instability. Everything, from the tilt of his head to the way he extended a hand, was calibrated to project engagement. But it was the eyes that mattered most. Courtiers believed that the emperor's gaze revealed his inner spirit, and so, when he looked upon his consort, he had to hold his eyes just long enough to suggest interest, but never long enough to suggest vulnerability. This subtle, practiced technique was whispered to new emperors by older eunuchs, how to command the room without giving away the emptiness behind it. When true arousal failed to arrive, which it often did after decades of mechanical encounters, the emperor had his tricks. Palace physicians brewed tonics and elixirs designed to stir warmth in the body. These mixtures combined rare herbs like ginseng, deer antler powder, and occasionally trace minerals believed to heat the blood. Some were sipped discreetly before the consort arrived. Others were rubbed into the skin under the guise of ceremonial oils. And if even that failed, he relied on ritualized motion, a series of symbolic gestures, slow and controlled, that mimicked desire without necessarily involving it. These movements were passed down like dance steps, each with a purpose, to fulfill expectation, to simulate closeness, to mark time. In many cases, the eunuch scribes outside the room were not listening for sound, but for rhythm, footsteps, shifting fabric, the clink of ceremonial ornaments, to ensure the emperor had fulfilled the appearance of duty. Some emperors developed what the records called the gesture of approval, a silent tap or nod offered during or after the encounter to signal that the consort had performed acceptably, regardless of whether the moment had meant anything. It was a mercy in a way. The woman might never know whether he had felt anything real, but the record would show she had pleased him. Her status might rise, her family might benefit, and he could go on pretending. There were also nights when the performance grew too heavy to bear. In such moments, emperors would simply simulate completion, giving a quiet signal, adjusting their robe in a rehearsed way, stepping back, just as the eunuchs opened the outer doors. To the court, the act was done. To the consort, it was over. To the emperor, it was just another night survived. Over time, this disconnection took its toll. Some emperors grew cold and mechanical, treating every intimate moment like a tax they had to pay. Others compensated with extravagance, commissioning elaborate furniture, rare scents, or intricate pre-bedchamber ceremonies, not for pleasure, but to distract themselves from how hollow it all felt. A few leaned into the performance, becoming experts in feigned affection, able to charm any woman while feeling nothing. These men were admired in court gossip, masters of the night, but many lived with a gnawing emptiness that no title could fill. Worse were the emperors who couldn't perform. Whether from age, illness, or disinterest, some lost the ability to sustain even the illusion. In those cases, reports were softened. Eunuchs might lie for him or encourage him to select and dismiss, inviting a woman but sending her away early with a gift, creating the appearance of favor. If done too often, however, rumors spread that the emperor was failing, that heaven had withdrawn its favor. These whispers were not merely gossip. They were political signals to generals, to ministers, to potential rivals. And so the emperor found himself in a strange trap. If he performed too eagerly, he risked accusations of indulgence. If he performed too coldly, he was accused of imbalance. And if he stopped performing at all, the very foundation of his rule began to crack. Behind the drapery, beneath the carefully arranged silks, lay a truth never spoken aloud, that even the Son of Heaven could be reduced to an actor in his own life. That he could lie with a woman, smile with his lips, move with precision, and yet feel nothing at all. That every night, while the court recorded success, the emperor himself disappeared a little more, buried beneath layers of protocol, performance, and the desperate need to appear desirable, even when desire had long since left him. In a palace where love was dangerous and passion was watched, it was not truth that mattered, only the illusion of it. And in the art of illusion, the emperor was expected to be flawless. In most of the world, the news of a pregnancy brings joy, anticipation, and dreams of the future. In the Forbidden City, it brought calculation, tension, and power. To carry the child of the emperor was not a private matter of love and family. It was a national event, a shift in the political landscape, a potential reordering of alliances, titles, and even the line of succession. And for the woman whose body carried that future, every heartbeat was both a privilege and a peril. From the moment a consort stepped out of the emperor's bedchamber, all eyes turned to her, not with affection, but with strategic interest. Had she conceived? Was she the one who would elevate her clan? Would her child one day sit upon the dragon throne? These weren't idle questions. They were matters of state security, dynastic continuity, and in some cases, life or death. Pregnancy in the imperial court was never about the woman. It was about the potential of what, or who, grew inside her. Her body became a container for the dynasty's survival, and once that possibility appeared, she ceased being merely a consort. She became a vessel, not metaphorically, literally. She was watched, measured, recorded. Her meals were carefully chosen. Her bedchamber's temperature regulated. Her visitors restricted. Even the color of the curtains around her bed might be changed, based on the season and the astrologer's recommendations. Once the first symptoms appeared, often nausea, fatigue, or changes in pulse, which palace doctors observed with unsettling obsession, she was placed under what was called heaven's observation. From that point on, her schedule was dictated not by her preferences, but by ancient manuals, political advisors, and physicians who worked not for her, but for the emperor's lineage. If confirmed, the pregnancy was announced not to her family, but to the Bureau of Imperial Records. Her name would be entered into the official register of those bearing imperial heirs. Her family might be rewarded with land, titles, or promotions. But this reward came with risk. If she miscarried, or if the child was born weak or still, the consequences could be devastating. Rumors of bad omens, of impurity, of spiritual imbalance could taint her name, and her family's fortunes could vanish just as quickly. Because of these stakes, her life became highly regulated. What she ate, what she touched, even what she smelled was dictated by palace doctors and court ritualists. She might be denied certain fruits, restricted from touching ink, forbidden to bathe at night. Even laughter could be discouraged, depending on the prevailing belief of the time. The goal was not her comfort, nor even her happiness. It was protection of the unborn, who from the first flutter was no longer her child alone, but a potential emperor, a tool of succession, a symbol of cosmic continuity. As the months passed, the control only deepened. She might be moved to a quieter section of the palace. Her servants reassigned, trusted eunuchs appointed to guard her door, not to protect her, but to ensure no one tampered with her fate. The possibility of poisoning, sabotage, or even sympathetic magic by rival consorts was considered real, and so she was isolated, swaddled not in love, but in surveillance. The birth itself was no less political. As labor began, the room filled not only with midwives, but with officials, ministers of rites, court astrologers, and even scribes, all of whom had to confirm the legitimacy of the moment. The hour of birth was recorded with meticulous precision, down to the phase of the moon and the direction of the wind. A child born at an inauspicious time might be marked before their first cry. A child born during a cosmic alignment could be celebrated as heaven's chosen. The mother, meanwhile, often labored in silence. Screaming was considered unseemly. Stoicism was encouraged. Pain was not acknowledged, not because it wasn't there, but because the woman's suffering was seen as secondary to the child's arrival. Even her death in childbirth, not uncommon in a time without modern medicine, might be seen not as tragedy, but as destiny, a sacrifice for the future of the realm. Once the child was born, the mother's fate became even more precarious. If she bore a daughter, she might be quickly forgotten. If the child was male, healthy and strong, her status could skyrocket. She might be promoted in rank, given greater living quarters, and honored with elaborate titles. But power brought danger. Other consorts might turn on her. Her child might be targeted. If the emperor's affection faded or political winds shifted, her status could vanish in an instant. And if her child died, whether in infancy or later, the mother might be accused of spiritual failure. Some were exiled to temples. Others lived the rest of their lives in quiet shame, marked by a loss that the palace treated not with compassion, but suspicion. In the Forbidden City, Women were more than companions. They were the cradle of the dynasty. Their worth was measured not in personality, intelligence, or even beauty, but in whether they could create the next link in the imperial chain. Their wombs were watched like fortresses. Their futures rose and fell with the invisible heartbeat of something growing inside. There was no room for tenderness, no songs sung to swelling bellies, no gentle cradling of hands in the middle of the night. There was only the record, the risk, and the weight of legacy. To be pregnant in the palace was to carry more than a child. It was to carry the empire, and to know that with every breath, every movement, every contraction, one woman's body was being measured against the future of 1,000 years. She wore the most elaborate crown, sat closest to the emperor during ceremonies, and was the only woman officially recorded as his wife. Yet within the walls of the Forbidden City, the empress, the so-called mother of the nation, often stood alone. Among thousands of concubines, countless whispers, and the ever-turning wheel of imperial favor, her position was both the highest and the most fragile. She was the sun by title, but she could be eclipsed by any rising moon in the harem. Chosen not necessarily for love, but for lineage, the empress was almost always selected from one of the great noble families. Her marriage was an alliance, brokered between court officials, empress dowagers, and astrologers who scoured birth charts for harmony. When she was crowned, the palace exploded in ceremonial splendor, but behind the rituals lay the beginning of a lifetime of tension, caution, and quiet isolation. As empress, she held administrative control over the inner palace. She was responsible for overseeing the behavior and hierarchy of all consorts and concubines. This meant she had theoretical authority over her rivals, the power to promote, demote, or discipline. She was the mother of the harem, and in name, its queen. But theory and reality in the Forbidden City rarely matched, because while the empress governed the household, the emperor governed affection, and affection was the true currency of power. If the emperor favored a particular concubine, visited her frequently, allowed her family influence at court, or permitted her opinions to shape his own, that woman could quickly become more powerful in practice than the empress herself. Though officially ranked lower, a favored consort could bypass protocols, secure lavish gifts, or sway important decisions. In such cases, the empress found herself in the most humiliating of positions, outranked in spirit, if not in law. Some empresses fought back. They tightened regulations, limited access to certain parts of the palace, or subtly arranged for rivals to be reassigned to remote quarters. Through their loyal eunuchs or trusted senior concubines, they waged cold wars behind silk screens, controlling who received invitations, who was seen during formal dinners, who was included in celebrations. These moves were never loud. The empress was expected to be dignified, unshakable, and above petty emotion. But make no mistake, behind the porcelain mask, sharp strategy often lurked. And yet, even with all her power, the empress could not forbid the emperor from choosing whom he pleased. If he wanted to elevate a low-ranking concubine to favored status, he could. If he wanted to see her knightly, he could. The empress might raise objections in private, citing tradition, hierarchy, or morality, but she could not stop him. She was the emperor's wife, not his keeper, and sometimes her resistance only hardened his resolve to show favoritism more boldly. Worse still was when the emperor's affection for the empress herself faded. A union that began with ceremony could dissolve into neglect. She might find herself no longer summoned, no longer consulted, treated more as a symbol than a person. Her chambers would remain ornate, her servants plentiful, her meals rich, but her voice would grow quieter in the ears of the palace. In some dynasties, empresses were politically savvy, forming alliances with ministers or empress dowagers to protect their positions. In others, they were quietly replaced, not in title, but in function, by a consort who became the de facto empress through influence alone. That consort might bear the emperor's favorite son, appear beside him in public processions, or even dictate policies through pillow talk, while the true empress sat alone, surrounded by rules and respect, but no real power. There were also darker fates. If the empress was accused of jealousy, cruelty, or involvement in a scandal, real or fabricated, she could be stripped of her title and confined to isolation. A few were forced to commit symbolic suicide to preserve the emperor's dignity. Others were quietly exiled to monasteries, where they spent the rest of their lives chanting sutras in distant silence, their names erased from official records. And yet, some empresses endured. They learned to navigate the ever-shifting tides of palace politics, neither too harsh nor too meek. They held the line of tradition, maintained decorum, and outlived their rivals. In the end, when the emperor passed and new succession wars broke out, it was often the empress, now the empress dowager, who emerged as regent, guardian of the heir, wielder of true power at last. But that was later. During the prime of her reign, the empress walked a knife's edge. She was honored, but not always loved, revered, but often ignored. Her every move was watched, not by a nation, but by 1,000 women, each one hoping for a single glance from the emperor that could shift the balance forever. She could command the halls of the inner palace, but not the heart of the man whose favor meant everything. She could issue orders, but she could not forbid desire. And in a palace built on illusion, she often found herself trapped in the most delicate one of all, that she was, in truth, the most powerful woman in China, because sometimes the crown did not shine on the brow where it rested. It shimmered instead where the emperor chose to look. There were rules for everything in the Forbidden City: how to walk, how to speak, how to bow, and especially how to feel, or more precisely, how not to feel. An emperor was expected to be many things: wise, restrained, balanced like the stars he was said to reflect. But he was never expected to fall in love. Certainly not in the way that made him forget protocol, overlook titles, or risk the balance of the court. And yet sometimes he did. And when that happened, entire empires trembled. Love, real, irrational, human love, had no place in a palace designed around control. The emperor could favor a woman, even show affection. But the moment that affection began to bend the machinery of the state, it became a threat, because a woman loved too deeply could rise too quickly. And when she rose, so did her family, her allies, her influence. Ministers watched this closely. The empress felt it first. The harem whispered like reeds in a storm. And jealousy, both in the private and political sense, ignited like a fuse. Take, for example, the tragic story of Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang Dynasty and Yang Guifei, perhaps the most infamous love affair in all of Chinese imperial history. Yang was beautiful, witty, and irresistibly charming. The emperor fell under her spell completely, elevating her from a minor concubine to the highest rank possible. But he didn't stop there. He empowered her family, appointed her cousin to high office, and ignored mounting complaints from his advisors. Ministers warned that her influence was becoming toxic, that the balance of court politics was unraveling. He refused to listen. And then, chaos. When rebellion broke out under General An Lushan, partly fueled by resentment of the imperial court's favoritism, the emperor was forced to flee the capital. Along the journey, his own guards demanded that Yang Guifei be executed. They blamed her for the instability, for the war, for the loss of their homeland. They believed that love had blinded their ruler and weakened the empire. And so, under a tree, surrounded by the remains of a collapsing dynasty, the emperor ordered the woman he adored to be taken away and strangled. His heart never recovered. He lived on but hollowed, and her name, etched in poems and history, became a symbol of how dangerous true feeling could be when worn like a jewel in the open air. But Yang Guifei was not alone in this pattern. Across dynasties, similar stories played out. Different names, same ruin. Emperors who couldn't let go, who ignored the warnings, who bent the machinery of court tradition to please a single woman, often lost more than just political favor. They lost their grip on the image they were meant to uphold, that of the celestial sovereign, untouched by personal desire. Even the smallest signs of deep emotional attachment could trigger scandal. If an emperor visited the same consort too often, her rivals grew suspicious. If she bore him multiple children while others were neglected, rumors of manipulation, witchcraft, or improper conduct spread like fire. Sometimes, other women took matters into their own hands. There were cases of poisoning, orchestrated miscarriages, and accusations that forced the emperor's hand to protect the balance, to save face, to restore the illusion of fairness. The empress, meanwhile, lived in silent dread of being replaced in all but name. A favored concubine who gained the emperor's ear and heart could begin influencing ceremonial decisions, festival preparations, or even state appointments. In a world where hierarchy ruled, love distorted the shape of power, and those who lived by titles saw their structure threatened by a glance, a smile, a quiet word in the dark. Yet even with the risks, emperors were still human. Some couldn't help but break the rules. They composed poems in private, visited favorite women under false pretenses, and risked the wrath of court officials just to hold on to the only person who made them feel seen. For a man trapped in ritual, true emotion was both a rebellion and a salvation. But in the imperial palace, rebellion came with a cost. Some emperors grew bitter after losing the woman they loved, withdrawing from the harem, falling into superstition, or becoming cruel. Others tried to immortalize their beloveds with statues, paintings, or shrines, only to be criticized for excess. One ruler, it was said, forbade the mention of any other woman in his presence after his consort died, and mourned her so openly that ministers questioned his ability to govern. Over time, love in the Forbidden City became not a blessing, but a warning. The more an emperor cared, the more vulnerable he became, not just emotionally, but politically. And so many rulers trained themselves not to feel too deeply, to rotate consorts on schedule, to keep affection locked away behind protocol and silence. It was safer that way, for them and for the empire. But in the rare moments when that mask slipped, when a ruler reached for someone not as a partner in ritual, but as a companion of the heart, that was when things cracked, when dynasties began to wobble, when ministers gathered in secret, when courtiers began counting days and watching doorways. In the most powerful palace in the world, love was not a sanctuary. It was a fault line, and when it moved, the tremor was felt from the harem to the throne, and sometimes far beyond. In a world where one child could inherit the mandate of heaven, the question of paternity was far more than a private matter. It was a matter of cosmic legitimacy. The birth of an heir in the Forbidden City was supposed to be the most carefully orchestrated event in the empire, a divine continuation of the emperor's bloodline. But within the shadows of red lacquered screens and the endless corridors of the inner palace, certainty was a luxury few could truly afford. Despite the elaborate rituals surrounding imperial intimacy, the timed visits, the registers, the astrologers, and physicians, a single fact remained inconveniently true. Only one person in the room truly knew who the father might be, and sometimes that person had her own reasons to lie. With hundreds, even thousands of women in the imperial harem, the emperor was expected to rotate visits, maintain harmony, and father children who would ensure political stability across the provinces. But the human body doesn't operate on schedule, and neither does favor. The emperor might visit one consort more than another, or neglect many entirely. Some women, desperate for relevance, were said to fake symptoms of pregnancy in hopes of being noticed. Others took more drastic steps. Rumors whispered through the palace walls told of women who arranged secret encounters with men, eunuchs who had faked their castration, low-ranking guards, even visiting musicians, risking everything to conceive a child they could pass off as imperial. How they did it remains hidden in fragments and half-remembered legends. Sometimes it involved braved servants, drugged attendants, or feigned fainting spells. In a world governed by appearances, all that mattered was the timing. If a woman could synchronize her act of deception with a documented imperial visit, even one that was brief or fruitless, she could plausibly claim conception. Once the pregnancy was declared, the machinery of the court would turn in her favor. She'd be assigned special care, protection, and status. The emperor, unless suspicious or alerted by rivals, would likely accept the news without protest, especially if the birth aligned with the stars, or if his relationship with the consort had been strong. After all, to question paternity was to question the system itself, and that was dangerous for everyone involved. But there were signs, subtle, often ignored, but present. A child born too early or too late compared to the registry's date of encounter. A boy who bore no resemblance to the emperor or his known lineage. A mother who refused examinations or manipulated her midwives. And sometimes, most damning of all, a rival consort who presented evidence, letters, witnesses, or confessions extracted through coercion. When suspicions arose, investigations followed, quiet at first, but intense. Eunuchs were questioned, servants disappeared, midwives were sent away to remote provinces. If the allegations proved credible, the consequences were brutal. The mother might be stripped of her title, her child removed from succession, or worse, publicly denounced as a traitor to the dynasty. Some were forced into religious exile, others vanished without a trace. As for the child, even if spared, they would live under the shadow of doubt, their every move watched, their every ambition questioned. Still, not all impostors were discovered. Some heirs rose through the ranks, declared princes, educated in statecraft, and revered by ministers, all while hiding the truth of their origins. A few may have even reached the throne. The empire, after all, valued appearance over truth. As long as the records were intact, as long as the court believed, the lie became indistinguishable from reality. But deception didn't always come from below. In rare cases, it was the emperor himself who manipulated lineage for political convenience. An unwanted pregnancy from a low-ranking concubine might be reassigned to a favored consort. A child whose mother fell out of grace could be quietly re-registered under another woman's name. The reasons varied: political alliances, astrological compatibility, the emperor's shifting favor, but the result was the same: a lineage altered by decree, not by blood. Some empresses, desperate to secure their place, went even further. If unable to conceive, they might claim a consort's child as their own, orchestrating the transition with the help of loyal eunuchs and silent midwives. Once the birth was recorded in her name, the child was raised under her care, groomed for power, insulated from the truth. In this web of ambition, fear, and manipulation, the idea of an emperor's true heir became increasingly blurred. Blood was sacred, but documents were decisive. And with enough power and control, almost any fiction could become fact. The tragedy, of course, fell hardest on the children themselves. Raised in opulence, told they were born to rule, many never knew, or only discovered too late, the cracks beneath their golden foundation. Some ruled with uncertainty, haunted by rumors. Others clung to the illusion, shaping their destinies with the ferocity of someone trying to outrun a shadow. In the Forbidden City, truth was never simple. It was wrapped in silk, sealed in scrolls, and whispered behind fans. And in the question of who truly fathered whom, the line between legacy and lie was drawn not by blood, but by those who controlled the story. And that story, once inked into the imperial registry, could not be undone. In the heart of the Forbidden City, where over 1,000 women awaited his glance, and the empire itself bowed to his every word, the emperor, the most powerful man in China, lived a life few would envy. Surrounded by luxury, tradition, and bodies, he often moved through his gilded world as a ghost, because what the world saw as indulgence was, for many emperors, a quiet and suffocating loneliness. One crafted not by absence, but by abundance, an overwhelming, inescapable tide of expectations and performance, in which choice had long since vanished. From the outside, the imperial harem appeared to be a dream of excess, vast, shimmering, seductive. But for the emperor, it was a labyrinth. Every woman, every gesture, every night was not about desire, but about obligation. He could not call upon a consort simply because he missed her or felt drawn to her. His visits were scheduled, his desires filtered through the calendar, the court, the stars. Even his moments of rest were choreographed. And so, while he was never physically alone, he was spiritually isolated. The women who surrounded him were not companions, but instruments of policy. Their smiles were polished, their words measured. None could truly speak freely, not without risk. Even the empress, the closest figure to a wife in the traditional sense, was often chosen by ministers and dowager empresses, not by the emperor himself. In such a space, intimacy was a mirror with no reflection. Every gesture he made returned to him rehearsed, filtered through fear, ambition, or ceremony. He could never be sure. Did she want him or his favor? Did her kindness mask calculation? Did she linger for warmth or for a better room and family advancement? This constant uncertainty wore down even the strongest minds. Some emperors grew distant, emotionally numb. Others buried themselves in state affairs or religion, preferring paperwork to people. A few lost themselves in rituals, finding comfort in the predictability of schedules, the precision of rites, the silence of command. But humans are not built to be alone, especially not those burdened with absolute power. And in rare, flickering moments, emperors broke the rules. They reached beyond the velvet walls of the harem, searching for something real, something unwritten. Thus forbidden connections were never officially acknowledged, but the whispers remain. Some spoke of emperors who fell for their maids, not concubines, not noblewomen, but the quiet hands who bathed them, brought their ink, folded their robes. In these maids, the emperor sometimes found not seduction, but simplicity, a brief, fleeting exchange untainted by politics. Yet even these fragile connections had to be hidden. If discovered, the woman could face exile or death. The emperor, humiliated, would be forced to deny it ever happened. Others whispered of deeper secrets. There are chronicles, carefully worded, cautiously ambiguous, that hint at emperors who loved those they were never meant to. Monks, perhaps, or temple novices who caught the ruler's gaze during sacred festivals. A gardener with clever eyes, a musician whose voice echoed too long after he bowed. In a place where every woman was already spoken for, already assigned, the emperor's forbidden desire sometimes wandered beyond the expected, and when it did, it became truly dangerous. Some emperors took refuge in secret correspondence, letters hidden beneath calligraphy scrolls, poems never read aloud, small tokens passed hand to hand in ritualized silence. Others arranged nighttime visits through labyrinthine back passages, guided by loyal eunuchs who risked everything to carry a glance or a message. These were not grand romances. They were delicate, trembling rebellions, moments of stolen humanity in a palace that demanded godhood. And always, the risk was absolute. If discovered, even the emperor might not escape unscathed. The court could turn on him. Ministers might use it as proof of imbalance, decadence, or spiritual impurity. The object of his affection, regardless of gender or status, would vanish quietly and completely. Some were sent to remote monasteries. Others were transferred to far-off posts and never heard from again. A few were simply erased from the records, and so the emperor returned to his schedule, to the women selected by astrology, to the chambers that smelled of incense and control. But inside, the memory of a voice, a glance, a forbidden touch stayed with him, both a comfort and a wound. Because in the Forbidden City, it was not the lack of love that stung the most. It was the impossibility of it. To feel deeply was to place someone in danger. To care was to gamble with lives. And so, the emperor learned to want quietly, to ache beneath silk and gold, to wear the loneliness like a second robe. He ruled a kingdom of 1,000 bodies, but no true confidants. His name echoed through halls, his image carved in stone, but his heart? That stayed hidden, buried beneath protocol, perfumed smiles, and the one truth no report would ever record, that the man with the most power had no freedom to choose whom to love. And when he finally did, it could cost him everything. Power could build empires. Passion could destroy them. The Forbidden City had seen countless rulers come and go, each cloaked in the dignity of ancient rituals and divine authority. But beneath the golden facade, history held a darker truth. Emperors who surrendered not to rebellion or invasion, but to their own unchecked appetites. The very pleasures that the world imagined as the emperor's reward, silk-draped chambers, obedient concubines, endless affection, often proved the most effective weapon against him. Not from without, but from within. Some rulers fell in love too deeply, others too often. A few simply couldn't stop. Surrounded by beauty, fed by praise, they drifted into indulgence, unaware or unwilling to see that the court was watching, that ministers, generals, and rivals were quietly taking note of each missed audience, each delayed edict, each rising concubine whose family suddenly received gifts and positions. One of the most notorious was Emperor Shunji of the Qing dynasty. Barely into adulthood, he fell desperately in love with a low-ranking consort known for her grace and serenity. He began to visit her almost exclusively, neglecting the traditional balance of the harem and the demands of state. His obsession became so obvious that his mother, the powerful Empress Dowager, intervened, not to protect his heart, but to protect the dynasty. The consort died under mysterious circumstances soon after, and the emperor, heartbroken, withdrew from politics and fell into spiritual despair. Some say he never recovered. Then there was Emperor Tang Xuanzong and his beloved Yang Guifei, a story that history remembers not for its romance, but for its consequences. As he elevated her status and empowered her family, he lost touch with the court. Corruption bloomed. The An Lushan rebellion exploded. Cities burned. Millions died. And as his soldiers dragged him to safety, they demanded her execution as the price of his survival. Love, in this case, didn't merely blind the emperor, it unbalanced the entire realm. For their enemies, these emotional attachments were opportunities. A favored woman became a lever. Her relatives could be bribed, her name used in rumors, her rise exaggerated until it became a political scandal. Rivals might plant servants in her quarters, fabricate letters, even stage accidental public appearances to make the emperor appear reckless. The goal was always the same: erode his image, suggest that the Son of Heaven had become a slave to his own desires, and it worked. Ministers began to question decisions. Generals delayed obedience. Factions formed, some in favor of moral reform, others plotting succession. Even if the emperor remained in power, his authority would rot from within. What began as longing ended in isolation. What began as desire ended in downfall. Because in the Forbidden City, there was no such thing as harmless love. Every glance could shift the court. Every favorite could tip the scale. And if an emperor loved too obviously, too wildly, or too long, his enemies didn't have to strike. They simply waited. His own heart would bring him to ruin. Time came for everyone, even for those who wore the mandate of heaven. The emperor might command armies, reorder provinces, and dictate the laws of nature by calendar and decree. But his body, aging slowly behind the red walls of the Forbidden City, followed its own path. And as vitality faded, the empire held its breath. Because in the ancient Chinese worldview, the health of the emperor's body mirrored the health of the state. If he was strong, the nation thrived. If he weakened, spiritually, physically, or intimately, it was seen as a crack in the celestial order. But the rituals did not stop. The women still waited. The charts were still drawn. The expectations remained. And so, even into their 70s, even into their 80s, emperors continued to perform, or pretend to. To support them, the court turned to an arsenal of ancient solutions. Taoist physicians created herbal elixirs and longevity pills crafted from deer antler, sea cucumber, ginseng, and the infamous red ginseng wine, believed to invigorate the blood. Some formulas included real gold dust or ground pearl, consumed with solemn reverence, despite their dubious medical value. More exotic potions were said to be extracted from bear bile or seahorse powder, ingredients linked more to belief than efficacy. But the focus wasn't only on medicine. Physical therapies became part of daily life. Acupuncture, cupping, qigong exercises practiced in the morning light. Some emperors were massaged daily with warming oils that claimed to reignite the yang fire. A few even followed detailed breathing rituals, hours of meditative inhalation and muscle control, said to restore inner balance and revitalize the body. And when even these failed, the illusion had to be maintained. A favored eunuch might discreetly signal when the emperor had finished, even if nothing had happened. A scheduled consort might be sent away early with a polite gift and a quiet promise of return. Meanwhile, the palace records, ever exact, ever loyal, would mark the night as a success. The appearance of intimacy mattered more than the act itself. Yet within these efforts was something deeper, the emperor's own fear, not just of physical decline, but of irrelevance. In a world where virility symbolized cosmic power, to lose desire was to lose meaning. Some emperors, facing this truth, clung harder to youth, surrounding themselves with ever younger concubines, commissioning portraits that depicted them in robust health, or even faking stamina during ceremonies to reassure the court. But others surrendered quietly. They stopped summoning women. They retreated into prayer, poetry, or silence. Some took refuge in Taoist alchemy, convinced that if they could master energy retention and spiritual stillness, they could live forever. And a few, perhaps the most tragic, simply faded, men who once ruled the tides of history, now whispering forgotten names in the dark, hoping to remember what it once felt like to be wanted. In those final years, the emperor's body became a battleground, not of politics, but of pride. The need to remain a symbol, the pressure to remain potent, and beneath it all, a very human ache to matter, even as the body failed. Because in the Forbidden City, old age wasn't a retreat. It was a test, one that many failed not with weakness, but with dignity denied. Even in death, the emperor's body was not his own. As the lifeless form of the Son of Heaven lay in state, still clad in imperial robes, surrounded by burning incense and hushed reverence, The palace was not mourning, it was orchestrating. For the passing of an emperor was not a personal loss, it was a cosmic rupture. And to restore balance, ritual had to fill the void. Every movement around the body, every offering, every word, all was prescribed, including, most hauntingly, what he, or rather who, would accompany him into the next life. The belief in the afterlife was not poetic metaphor for the Chinese court. It was tangible, structured, and bureaucratically mapped. The emperor would continue to reign in the realm beyond, and so his spirit required the same luxuries, power, and companionship that he had enjoyed on earth. That meant servants, that meant objects, and sometimes that meant women. In early dynasties, it was not uncommon for concubines, especially those without children or high status, to be buried alongside the emperor, sometimes willingly, often not. These were called accompanying burials, and the justification was spiritual. The emperor could not walk alone into eternity. His body needed comfort, warmth, loyalty, and his spirit needed the same. Those selected would be dressed in ceremonial silks, bathed in fragrant oils, and escorted, sometimes drugged or already lifeless, to the imperial tomb. Official records were vague, often using euphemisms like joined him in peace or followed the light of heaven. But archaeological digs have revealed chambers where female skeletons lay beside the emperors, arranged in symmetrical formations. In some cases, they were clasping jade symbols. In others, curled into postures of eternal servitude. Later dynasties sought to distance themselves from this brutality. Laws were issued to prohibit live burial. Yet traditions persisted. Some concubines chose, or were convinced, to end their lives voluntarily in mourning, to maintain the honor of having been loved by a divine ruler. A few were canonized posthumously as faithful spirits. Others simply disappeared from the records the moment the emperor exhaled his final breath. The emperor's body was treated like a sacred relic. It was washed with ritual water, wrapped in dragon-emblazoned silk, and placed in a double coffin made of sandalwood and cypress. His vital organs were often preserved in urns. Prayers were chanted, stars consulted, and geomancers chose the exact direction his head would face for optimal harmony in the afterlife. Alongside his body were placed dozens of objects: jade scepters, golden dishes, erotic artworks, miniature representations of the harem, even carved figurines meant to symbolize continued pleasure beyond the grave. Because if his role as ruler was eternal, so too was his role as man, dominant, desired, revered. And so the silence of death echoed not with peace, but with performance. Even in stillness, the emperor remained a character in the great ritual play of the dynasty, and his desires, real or projected, followed him beneath the earth. Centuries later, when the stones of the Forbidden City were opened not by servants, but by scholars, a new kind of ritual began, the ritual of truth. Modern historians, armed with carbon dating, archived scrolls, and cautious skepticism, began peeling back the lacquered myths of imperial intimacy. What they discovered was not only a world of astonishing control, but a staggering mixture of truth, exaggeration, and outright fiction. Yes, the imperial harem was vast. Yes, intimacy was regulated by ritual. Yes, eunuchs held extraordinary power over the private lives of emperors. But the stories of nightly escapades with hundreds of women, of immortal elixirs made from gold and mercury, of wild orgies in moonlit gardens. Many of these tales were shaped or twisted by foreign envoys, Qing-era gossip, or later Republican-era reformists eager to portray the monarchy as decadent and backward. Much of what we know about Chinese emperors and their intimate lives comes not from primary documents, but from novels, operas, and dramatized histories. These accounts were never intended to be accurate. They were morality tales, political critiques in disguise, or sensational literature designed to enthrall readers and sell copies. And yet, the real truth may be even more haunting. Because while the stories of extravagance may be overstated, the loneliness, the pressure, the surveillance, all are very real. Recent studies of imperial logs, intimacy registries, and buried medical reports confirm a system so rigid and dehumanizing that passion itself became a political liability. Today, Chinese scholars approach this legacy with caution. Some aim to restore dignity to the figures whose humanity was erased by ritual. Others view it as a cultural cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when tradition ossifies and power is trapped in performance. The Forbidden City is now a museum. Its chambers are silent, but the myths remain, lingering like incense, not easily dispelled. In modern Chinese audiences, they remain fascinated. Films, dramas, and historical novels continue to explore and romanticize the lives of consorts, eunuchs, and emperors. Some seek the truth, others seek the fantasy, but all are drawn to the same question. What did it feel like to live in a palace of power where even desire had rules? It was quiet, not the ceremonial silence of a palace awaiting a decree, but the real, fragile silence of a world that had finally let go. No drums, no lanterns, no scent of sandalwood curling toward a chamber ceiling. The last emperor of the last Chinese dynasty did not spend his final night with 1,000 women waiting in perfumed shadows. He spent it alone. Puyi, the boy who once sat on the dragon throne, dressed in yellow robes so heavy they nearly swallowed his tiny frame, lived to see the world beyond the walls of the Forbidden City, and it did not bow. His final years were not spent issuing edicts or choosing concubines. They were spent in a small courtyard house under communist supervision, tending plants, reading newspapers, and trying, in his own quiet way, to understand who he had been. There was no harem, no eunuchs, no red plaques or astrological calendars, only memories, some vivid, others blunted by time and shame. The rituals he had once followed like scripture now seemed surreal. The bodies he had once passed through corridors, the eyes that had once waited for his approval, gone. And perhaps, in that final night, as he lay beneath a plain blanket instead of embroidered silk, Puyi felt the last breath of the illusion fading, that all the control, all the ceremony, all the careful staging of a life devoted to managing desire, legacy, and perception had always been just that, a stage. The real emperor, stripped of title, power, and myth, was simply a man, one who had never chosen whom to love, who to be, or how to escape the rituals that had caged his body and erased his heart. In that final darkness, there was no procession, no celestial music, no red lacquered doors closing behind him, just stillness, and perhaps, for the first time, freedom.